Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Fit RX. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Dennis. Very excited for my next guest. I've actually wanted to get him on the show for a while and then happened to run into him at the low carb conference in Denver not too long ago. But Dave Feldman, you may have heard of him if you follow anything about cholesterol. But Dave, and I'll let him tell his story of how he got into this, but he has really become an expert in the field of cholesterol, even though he is not a physician, but just very well respected in this field. And again, has just dug into it and just really become an expert and has taught a lot of us clinicians, about things such as a lean mass hyperresponder, which I never knew what that was. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. But anyways, Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Greg.
Well, tell us, if you will, first, just since this is the first time I've had you on. So you're, if I remember correctly, you're an engineer by trade. And how does an engineer get into the cholesterol space? I know you probably get tired of telling this story, but for my listeners, again, who may not be familiar with you, give us kind of a summary of that evolution.
Yeah, here's the overly shortened version. Basically, I was trying to keep from becoming diabetic. My dad's side of the family is rampant with diabetes, and my A1C had been in pre-diabetic range for 2 years in a row. And so I went and did my research, and at that time, this was 2015, LCHF, low carb high fat, was coming up. Keto wasn't actually that big yet, but of course the principles are the same, which is to bring carbs way down and to become fat adapted. And as I did, I really felt great, was really enjoying it. My dad and my sister got inspired to do the same thing at the same time, and we all got our blood work close to each other. About 6-7 months later, their cholesterol did not go up, but mine did. My cholesterol went up substantially. And so I became obsessed with trying to figure out why that was. And in short, I started realizing that the system in our bodies, the biological system that moves around cholesterol, the lipid system, is very comparable to a network. And as a software engineer, I work on networks all the time. So it actually became very analogous. And at that point, I not only was interested in learning more about it, but I started doing a number of self-experiments to better elucidate these relationships and understand it better.
Now, did you have a physician that you were working with at the time that, to where you kept getting these cholesterol panels, and did he or she know what you were doing?
Yeah, my physician at the time, I was fortunate in that he was relatively patient. He could tell I was extremely motivated to understand this better. And in effect, I kept passing along this information. He did feel that it was important to lower LDL cholesterol. And I said I wasn't quite in the position yet where I wanted to make that call, given how many things had improved that did associate with cardiovascular disease. So I mentioned my diabetes, but also my waist to hip ratio dropped, my blood pressure dropped, a number of things improved. And so I said, I really kind of want to zero in and see what I can do to better understand what's going on with the cholesterol. And then maybe I can find what it was that was different about me that wasn't the same with my dad and my sister as to why my cholesterol increased. And that's basically what led me to where I am at 7.5 years later, in what I thought might be a few weeks and then a few months. And now, of course, we're coming up on a decade of intensive research. We're now, of course, published in 4 papers with more on the way. And then there's the major study, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah. And so you started the Cholesterol Code, which is a website where you have a lot of information on there just about cholesterol. Is that where you still put a lot of your information out there?
I was a lot more active in the beginning when I was first determining this, because I just needed to put it out somewhere. And so I started this blog, cholesterolcode.com, at the time. and was just rapidly posting my data as I was doing these experiments that got more and more attention from people in low carb. Then I started doing presentations, posting those presentations back to cholesterolcode.com. Although, to be fair, I actually post to it less than I ever have before. There's still quite a lot of information that goes up there, but quite literally, a lot of what's going to end up written down will actually end up being in literature, because I'm working with researchers and doctors and so forth, and actually publishing a lot of this research now.
Nice. So what kind of answer did you come up with as to why? Well, before I ask that question, if you will, just to kind of give us a reference, like if you don't mind sharing your numbers, like how much did your LDL increase when you went on this low carb, high fat diet? And then I guess the second part of that question is what did you figure out as to why yours went up to where maybe your family members didn't?
Yes, actually, first of all, I'm comfortable sharing and have been sharing virtually all my data all the time. And in fact, often when I publish something, I'll publish the raw data in some form and for some access. And if I don't, usually people can request it and I can provide it. But basically, my total total cholesterol, I want to say, was somewhere in the neighborhood of around 180, 190 through most of my life, and had gone up to something in the neighborhood of around 320 on that first cholesterol test. My LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, around 120 to 130 most of my life, which, if you look at population averages, is right about at the middle, especially for males at my age at that time. And it had jumped to something more in the neighborhood of around 240, 250. I think at the last blood test I got just this last month, it came in at around 270, which is probably close to my average when I'm fully ketogenic. And yeah, I then started to realize pretty early on, maybe one major difference between myself and my sister and my dad is actually our status metabolically. So you hear the term metabolic health a lot, and we can kind of get into that in a moment. But compared to my, my immediate family members, and they'll concede this themselves, I, especially at that time, I was a lot more fit. I was doing running, for example, and I was a bit leaner. And I started to notice that that was also a common pattern with other people who saw this quote unquote hyper response. So that unintuitively, those going on low carb who saw the highest levels of LDL, like myself, tended to not just be metabolically healthy, but tended to be leaner. And actually, the leaner folks were, the more their cholesterol would rise. And this would ultimately lead me towards the phenotype you mentioned earlier, lean mass hyperresponders.
So I guess talk a little bit more about that, if you will, as far as, maybe we don't have to get real in depth, but like what is going on physiologically that's causing that significant rise?
Yeah, so here's my layperson version. Getting back to the term metabolism, metabolism is this counterbalance between the building up of stuff, which is anabolism, and the breaking down of stuff, which is catabolism. And basically, you could say that where we most focus in health and physiology on what good metabolism is in the area of fuel. How good is your body at putting fuel away and then accessing it, getting it back out again? And a good signal for that is how much is left over in the bloodstream at any given time. So diabetes is a disease of dysregulation. You often see the fuel that's going up and down, especially in the area of especially in the area of glucose. But this also shows up in the stored form of fat that's in the bloodstream known as triglycerides. So where this start making sense to me, and what gave rise to this phenotype, was not only was I leaner and that showed a higher increase in my LDL cholesterol, but in that same lipid panel that gives you those four metrics, not just LDL, but also total HDL and triglycerides, I noticed my HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, was higher, and my triglycerides, that measure of fat in the blood, was lower. Well, as you learn about how this system that moves around these fuels work, sure enough, those who tend to be more metabolically healthy seem to have low triglyceride levels and high HDL cholesterol levels. And what I started working out back then was that perhaps maybe my LDL was a bit higher because I was trafficking more of those vehicles in the bloodstream. These kind of, you could almost call them submarines or boats that our body makes that make fat mobile in the bloodstream. Since it's a water soluble environment, we need to put it in something that can be soluble inside the bloodstream. And so these vehicles, these VLDL, which are like the precursor to LDL, they're bloated with triglycerides. But if you have faster turnover, if you have cells that quickly accept the triglyceride cargo off of these boats, then your triglyceride levels at any given moment actually are low, even if you're trafficking them a lot, because they're getting quickly delivered. And interestingly, that means the VLDL that they started out in will remodel quickly to LDL. That could explain why there's higher LDL and lower triglycerides. And then more recently, I realized that actually a lot of the good reason for why there might be higher HDL is because the HDL particles are something that starts small and gets big, while the VLDL start big and get small. So you have one fleet of boats that are delivering the triglycerides, and that process is a bit messy. But then you have this other fleet of boats that are picking up a lot of the surface components, phospholipids, but also cholesterol from that process. And so that process of delivering fat to the tissues is part of that metabolic health. And that's why more and more I saw that it wasn't just the high LDL and the high HDL and low triglycerides with me, but that was with a lot of folks. In fact, the people who were the leanest and most athletic would have the highest LDL and highest HDL, along with the lowest triglycerides. The extreme of that triad would get larger and larger. And yet they were almost invariably, almost always very metabolically healthy.
As you were learning all this and studying all this over the years, was your physician just continuing to want to put you on a statin medication, or was he open to some of these things you were learning, or what was their kind of reaction to all this?
He was actually becoming more and more open. I sometimes joke he was the first doctor I was getting to recognize this energy model that I was developing. I call it the lipid energy model. In fact, I joked with him several times, hey, you're going to have to start paying me, because our visits would turn into half me looking at my most recent blood work, and then the other half going, so where's the research at now? He would ask me, what did I learn next? I was showing him graphs. I was discussing things with him. To him, it was making a lot of sense. And he did occasionally say, it's still your choice. You could still, from his perspective, it's playing it safer to go ahead and take steps to lower LDL cholesterol. And to be a good scientist, let me just state plainly, he could be right. It could be that there really is still a risk that's going to be associated with higher LDL. But to that extent, I reassured him, as I have everybody publicly, that I'm not making any assumptions of certainty. I have had 3 CACs. I've had 2 CT angiograms. I've had a lot of advanced testing like flow-mediated dilation, things along these lines that have me very acutely aware of the exact cardiovascular health I have, not just in lipid markers, but in particular in the actual physical presence of disease.
Very nice. Well, at least he was open to hear about, this. I feel like so many kind of conventional doctors, my listeners have heard me talk about this before, but are just so close-minded, and, they're just tunnel vision, cholesterol bad, you have to get your cholesterol down as low as possible. Whereas I really think it's more about metabolic health that you talked about. And if you're metabolically healthy, I feel like for the most part, you may not have to worry about cholesterol. I don't know that you can say it's black and white like that, but I feel like that's where we miss the boat most of the time, is we should focus more on metabolic health. not necessarily, these numbers, as you mentioned. And which kind of brings me to your research in the most recent study. I mean, you're doing a lot of great work because there are people like yourself out there that go on a low carb diet and they really get healthier and all their other numbers probably improve and they feel better, but then they have this outlier of this high cholesterol, and that there's always, they're always kind of concerned about, and I'm sure their doctors are concerned about. And so um tell us about the recent studies that you're doing that you presented at the conference.
Yes. So you're speaking to Low Carb Denver. You and I
Yes.
had a chance to connect there. And the study you're speaking to has been very central to my life for literally 5 years. I had actually even created a public charity that mostly centers on fundraising for this study. The charity is called Citizen Science Foundation. And we wanted to study this exact phenotype, these lean mass hyperresponders, and whether or not they were presenting with plaque at baseline and longitudinally, whether or not they would develop it by scanning them twice. There's a scan that's at day 0 for each participant, and then a second scan about 1 year later. Originally, when we were doing the study, we thought we'd need 5 years to follow each of these participants. But after connecting with Dr. Matt Budoff, who's our principal investigator, who's a preventative cardiologist and extremely well decorated in the field, he's actually done a huge number of studies. He has like 1,200 papers to his name. He made the case for us very early on that no, actually 1 year is more than enough time. These folks, given the phenotype, has the original one that I had set at LDL of 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher at that exposure level and at the resolution that you have with modern day CT angiograms, you can absolutely see this change in plaque, particularly at the aggregate level, at a population level. And therefore, we could do a comparison, not just between each other's own scans, but also there's an additional study that's going on called Miami Heart that's under Dr. Nasir Karam, who we're collaborating with right now, who's going to make us a match cohort from his study, because there's a healthy cohort with Miami Heart who we can match in many respects with ours that are from this LMHR study, so that we can see how they compare to the general population. And I'm excited because, yes, as you probably saw at the Low Carb Denver, this initial data has just been amazing. I can't speak too much to offset what's coming, which is going to be a preliminary paper. But at that conference, I was able to reveal that indeed, now that we have the first 100 scans, so we have this prelim data, our average age is 55, so they're well into middle age. 60 of our 100 participants are male, and they've been on the ketogenic diet and presumably near this profile for about 4.4 years, so nearly half a decade. And their average LDL cholesterol is around 260, which is in the very top 10% of the top 1% of the population, so 99.9%. For sure, my doctor, your doctor, everybody's doctors, I mean, they're definitely going to be concerned at those levels. But I will say the prelim data was quite compelling, so much so that we really want to do this prelim paper because the total plaque score was surprisingly low. In fact, the majority of participants had 0 total plaque score. That's to say there was no detectable visible plaque at all in their CT angiograms. And those that did have plaque, out of a possible score of 45, were in the single digits. We didn't actually even have a single participant thus far in the double digits. And that was just totally stunning for us. We decided at that point that we'd want to move towards publication. Now, again, I'll caution, we want to get that Miami Heart match because we want to feel confident that we're looking at a likewise group. Our group, of course, is low in cardiovascular risk factors that could be relevant. There are some participants that have more advanced calcification, but even then, as I said in the presentation, even in the case of calcified plaque, it looked very comparable to a zero risk factor group. So the stratifications look very promising, but I don't want to say too much more until we see that Miami Heart match and we get that prelim paper out.
Gotcha. And that will be when? Do we know?
Hopefully in a few months. I'm sure if you've seen some of the sausage making with studies and publications and so forth, it's never it's never a predictable, straightforward process. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay. So the people in this study, did they all have a very low CAC score starting out? So there wasn't any that had like moderate plaque, and you were looking at progression. I mean, they were all low to begin with. Is that correct?
Yes. Let me, perhaps a better way to answer that is there was not there's not exclusion criteria depending on what their plaque levels were. We knew, and this is typically the case, that if you grab 100 random people from a zero risk factor population, you will have some number of folks, for example, that have higher calcification, who just have asymptomatic cardiovascular disease at some level, right? The question is, what does that group look like compared to another likewise group, particularly when that group had been at sky high levels of LDL for nearly half a decade? And that's why we're interested in that aspect of it. So again, I don't want to sound as if our population has zero plaque. There definitely were folks with, total plaque score even in the single digits. Some can even have some level of stenoses that would be considered relevant to their doctor. The question is, at a population level, does this look like a low risk population in spite of having a half decade at those high LDL levels? And that's why we're in the push to try to get this match done as soon as possible.
Gotcha. There's obviously so many variables, in a study like this, population. I mean, how many of those factors were you looking at? I mean, were any of them smokers? Were they exercising regularly? I mean, they were all low carb people. How many of those factors did you look at?
Well, there 31 of the 100 report a family history of heart disease. There were 2 or 3 that were former smokers. So that's relevant. And the 2 that I think on site were slightly into the range of hypertensive. One that was reporting chest pain, but I'm not fully unblinded to the data. So these are large aggregates. As the funder, I'm not supposed to have, granular data. So I can only get these in kind of their broad strokes, right? So that's kind of a quick outline of, out of this population of 100, how many folks we have that have anything, if you will. There's always been one confounder I've been worried about since the get-go, and that I've talked about publicly many times, which is this phenotype, even though it's a lipid profile configuration, as it were, these 3 together, this triad, it does tend to go with folks that are not just lean, but typically often very athletic. I know from working with this population that some of them are kind of ultra exercisers, like ultra marathoners and so forth. That always concerned me because I feel like that could be a confounder too. Some folks, you may already be familiar, exercise to the extent to where they do not give themselves a lot of recovery time and often will have advanced heart disease. Runners can be some of the worst because they can get really addicted to running. And that's why you often find folks that drop dead, sometimes in the middle of a race in their 50s or 60s, right? But that was a concern that I had, that we might have some folks that are at those levels that might come into the study. Outside of that, we do much of our eligibility criteria was there to rule out more common cardiovascular risk factors, such as a prior diagnosis of heart disease, things along those lines, regardless of what plaque we found at baseline.
If this second study mirrors the results that you're seeing from the first study, how public do you think this will go? I feel like a lot of medicine. I figured this out kind of later in my career, but it's ran by big pharma. And it's a lot about money. And so when you get conflicting data like that says, hey, there may be some people here that even though their cholesterol's high, they don't need statin drugs. uh, do, do you think that message will get out there?
Well, so two things. One, you mentioned the second study. We hadn't had a chance to talk about that yet. I'll just say that that was one of the other major announcements at Low Carb Denver, is that we're now in talks for setting up a companion study. More details on that soon. But to your main point, to be sure, there are a lot of doctors, a lot of low carb doctors right this moment who want anything. They're like, look, I just need that. We just don't have any data. This is brand new territory. It's a new frontier. And I want to at least have something to give some sense of whether or not this is at least a high or low magnitude of risk. What I think, and certainly something I've speculated on openly many times before, is that there'll be a number of folks who are in favor of lowering LDL cholesterol and ApoB who will say, okay, maybe this group is lower risk. Lean mass hyperresponders, maybe they are low risk for cardiovascular disease overall. However, it's suboptimal low risk, as in they would be better still if they lowered their LDL further, if they lowered their ApoB further. And my answer to that would be, sure, I'll agree with that in advance. It's harder to isolate and study a small magnitude effect than it is to study a large magnitude of effect. But as you know, lean mass hyperresponders right now in doctors' offices around the world, they're not getting told that they're at a low risk. They're definitely being told regularly. We have them coming into the groups all the time that they're at a high risk. And again, to be a good scientist, I can't say either way until we prospectively get the data like we're doing now. But that high versus low magnitude of risk is what a lot of low carb doctors need right now, because a lot of times we're not even necessarily talking about people that just want to lose weight and could choose from a lot of different diets. The people we're especially interested in, certainly the people I'm very interested in, are folks like epileptics or those with severe type 1 diabetes or ones with ulcerative colitis who have found unique benefit from keto and have all these things that have improved, save this one thing that is now, nagging at them and is concerning if there is a big magnitude of effect. And so helping to answer that question, I think, will really move the needle for a lot of folks.
Is that your main focus and message? I know that's where you've done a lot of the studies, but in this kind of lean mass hyper responder group, I mean, do you get much into the kind of the general discussion of cholesterol? And, is it that important? Is it overblown? I mean, and a statin versus not a statin. And I know you're just a researcher and not a clinician, but I mean, do you kind of get into that space a little bit, or are you real focused on those lean mass hyper responders?
I'm super, super focused on the physiology and on the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, because to me, that's the horse before the cart. A lot of folks do ask me on medication, what do you think about statins? What do you think about PCSK9 inhibitors, et cetera? And I'm usually pressing to set that aside. Like, basically, the first question is, should you take steps to lower your LDL? Okay, and under what contexts? Because currently the expectation is under every context. Under every context, lower is better, and for that matter, high LDL is always bad, right? And I think that lean mass hyperresponders have provided us a very unique scientific opportunity. When have we seen in our lifetime, really, anything that's been as well regarded as the lipid hypothesis as effectively considered fact? That it's the modern pathogen of our body that's well known to just be rapidly destroying our cardiovascular system. So if that's true, in a roundabout way, lean mass hyperresponders might even prove Brown and Goldstein completely right. and in a way like no other could. The problem is that up until this point, we've just only ever gotten data from populations that are either partially or exclusively focused on people who have some form of dysfunction in their lipid metabolism. And that's a big deal because lipoproteins are part of metabolism. That's what I was talking about earlier. That's why we've always needed to get to some point in time where we could truly disentangle the two. And that's why I think lean mass hyperresponders are very unique in that we never really had such a population with such sky high LDL, yet also high HDL, low triglycerides that we're looking at prospectively and exclusively. And in that regard, I think they really could possibly move the landscape. They could really shift the paradigm.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. So do you get much, I guess, kind of kickback from the general cardiologists out there? I don't know, a lot of the cardiologist, I guess, seems to be the worst. Again, at the lower the LDL, the better. You should under any circumstance. And I mean, again, you're becoming a well-known entity in this space. But do you get some kind of kickback from those general cardiologists being like, oh, I don't, that's a bunch of crap?
Absolutely. There's a few that I'm well known for chatting back and forth with on Twitter. I never miss the opportunity when I can, though, to emphasize that I think that the vast majority of them are well-intentioned. From
Sure.
their perspective, patients are coming into their office. They'll tell me this straight up. They'll say their patient heard from Dave Feldman that their high LDL is okay. And I remind them, as I'll remind you and everybody else, I don't know that I've ever said that. I don't, because it's way too confident. I will state only this much. I've stated multiple times that I'm cautiously optimistic that high LDL, as is possibly resulting from fat adaptation, may not be concerning. But again, stating cautiously optimistic is by no means stating completely confident. On the contrary, it's stating, caution is meant to acknowledge that there could be danger. And optimism is a leaning, but it's by no means a certainty. That said, the one thing that I would challenge existing cardiologists, lipidologists, everybody everywhere, study them. It's very odd to this day that there needs to be this spearheading by an engineer completely outside the field on what is absolutely a novel population. And there's just no question on that. And it's still happening. Like I still have yet, I'm waiting for folks to come to, for example, our Facebook groups where we have like 10,000 as members in our lean mass hyperresponder Facebook group. I keep waiting for others to come and seek recruitment. I'd love to help them study this population, but there's a surprising lack of interest in these folks in spite of what they've already shown us so far.
Interesting. Well, so is this a full-time gig for you now, or what is your life like now? Just
More than
research?
full-time. Yes. Okay. Don't get me wrong. I'm not thinking I'll be doing this forever. And I'm mainly just driving towards the answer to two questions. One of them is the one we've talked about just now, which is whether or not lean mass hyperresponders, or just for that matter, whether or not fat adaptation as would be influencing LDL and ApoB is I hope, lower risk than what is being presumed by modern medicine. But the other question is the more complex and interesting one, which is whether or not the energy model that I work on, the one I kind of gave a briefing on earlier, has legs to it. If so, that could be very meaningful as well. It's already being kind of applied, at least in principle, for those folks who do want to lower their LDL, because usually it just requires that they reintroduce a moderate amount of carbohydrates to replete their liver glycogen stores. For more on that, go to cholesterolcode.com/papers, and you can read through our papers, and they'll get more into detail on the deeper specifics on how the whole energy model works and so on and so forth.
Okay. So Are you still a low carb guy yourself?
Oh yeah, love low carb. I do best when I'm very militantly keto.
Mhm,
But if I'm being honest, I'm not always on target. I bounce between keto and low carb, but I would say that I almost never go, say, above 120 carbs, like even in my cheatiest of times. Like to me, a
mhm,
cheat is having buns on the burger, right?
mhm, mhm.
But I wouldn't say have buns on the burger on top of having fries, having
Sure.
a shake, and something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, so what's the best place for people to follow you, to follow this kind of newer stuff that's coming out?
Well, of course, there's the foundation itself, the citizensciencefoundation.org website is a great place to go. Even
And
though we don't
can you
update
repeat
it.
that? I'm sorry.
Oh,
Citizen
citizensciencefoundation.org.
Science. Okay. Gotcha.
Cholesterolcode.com, even though we don't update it as often, it still gets updated and it's still where we're putting up these papers as we're publishing them and other updates. And then of course there's our website for diagnostic services through blood work, Own Your Labs, which we also leverage to help citizen science. And you can too. If you get your blood work through there, we have it check out the option for people to opt in to supply their anonymized data. And their anonymized data can go towards a shared citizen science data pool, which we'll eventually do a release on. But again, everyone's anonymized, but we want to make more of that data available for both formal and citizen researchers alike. And of course, I'm very active on Twitter. Real Dave Feldman.
Dave Feldman. Okay. Very nice. Well, certainly doing some groundbreaking stuff. It's really exciting. Um, as we wrap up here, I always ask my guest if they could give us one health tip that would make us healthier today. What would you say to that?
I would strongly recommend not consuming anything but water 4 hours before you go to bed.
Okay.
That's one thing I would stand by. I mean, intermittent fasting, that's great, etc. But if there's any one thing, given what I've learned, especially with cardiovascular disease and general metabolic health, it's to at least be careful about consuming too close to when you go to sleep.
Yep. Yep. Great advice. Okay. Well, anything else you want to throw out there here at the end that I didn't ask you?
No, I think my conversations with everyone will be very different this time next year. So it should get
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. We look forward to that. So, okay. Well, yeah, great stuff. Dave Feldman, really appreciate your time and coming on, and just appreciate what you're doing in this space, and appreciate everyone listening. And we will talk to you next time.
Thanks for having me on.